Guild Wars 2 has a gearing problem, and we need to talk about it. So I've been playing this game for 8 years, and even for me, the gearing process is still pretty, all over the place, but tenfold for a new player. See, I've been trying to write part 2 of my beginner's guide where I talk about ascended gearing, but I realized while writing that I then need to explain how roles work for PvE content, but then I'd need to talk about the gear you want for those roles, and a lot of those gear stats are only available from stat-selectable gear. Things like Vipers and Grieving for condition damage, or Harrier for support builds, Diviners or Ritualists for hybrid builds. These are all stats that are used a lot in a lot of the current builds for the game. And they're kind of tricky to earn. What also prompted this discussion is that half a dozen friends of mine have recently gotten into Guild Wars 2. A mix of new and returning players, but guiding them has been a real eye-opening experience, as the gearing process has been kind of lost on me over these years. I've never really considered just how messy and disjointed this all is until I heard myself explaining this to new players. Now you have to understand, this all comes from a place of love. I love this game. It is my favorite video game. So I say all this as someone who wants that new player experience to improve so that more people can come along and get hooked on Guild Wars 2 like it hooked me. So I want you to picture a brand new player. They've just hit level 80 after finishing the personal story, or they've boosted a level 80 character. They've got some sort of exotic gear set going, and they jump straight into End of Dragons. They finished the story. It wasn't crazy difficult, but they might have struggled a bit here and there. Now they're looking to get into Strikes, the new 10-man endgame content that arrived with End of Dragons. But before that, they want the right gear for their build. Now I know gear isn't actually that important. I mean, it certainly helps, but you can clear the content without the perfect stats. Learning your class is definitely the first priority. This is definitely more of a perception issue, where new players will hesitate to even try out the endgame content before they've got the right build, because they're worried that they won't contribute enough. Gear also acts as this, carrot on the stick. It gives them a direction, and if that direction is vague and convoluted, they'll just get stuck. I think it's a big reason why we don't see a lot of players even attempting endgame activities like raids or strikes. So, they've been playing as a willbender and read online that they'll want Grieving and Vipers stats for their condition DPS build. What do you tell this player? Where do you suggest they go to earn Grieving and Vipers stat gear through gameplay? Verdant Brink, the first map of the first expansion. I mentioned this in part 1 of my beginner's guide, where you're supposed to grind events on this one specific map to farm for airship parts that they can spend at a vendor to then buy stat-selectable exotic armor, after they've unlocked the mastery to access the vendor, that is. You can also do, glorious or triumphant reward tracks in PvP or World vs. World. And if you want to buy some cheap alternatives, there's random unrelated gear boxes that you can buy on the trading post, like the Ice Golem Moor helmet, the Ebon Vanguard shoulders. You can buy one of these, lucky back pieces from the Lunar New Year Festival. So that's a few slots down, I guess, but what about trinkets? Well, you can get one amulet, ring, and accessory through your Elite Spec collection in the Achievements panel. But what about a weapon? Well, you can get one from starting to train your Elite Spec, but if it's not the weapon you need, then there's these Iron Legion weapons you can buy from the trading post that came from the Icebrood Saga release, and they're stat selectable. So just a ring and an accessory to go. And, even here, I'm a bit lost. To be honest, I don't really know a good source of getting another stat-selectable exotic ring and accessory. And you can see where I'm going with this. It's really complicated and all over the place. The reason I won't be mentioning crafting is that while it's a big part of Guild Wars 2, new players coming from other MMOs aren't exactly logging in expecting to dive into crafting as their primary source of gear. They're probably not going to want to follow a crafting leveling guide online and spend a big chunk of gold on maxing it out. And to be honest, I don't blame them. I myself have only 2 of the weaponsmithing disciplines maxed out. Crafting recipes definitely offer an enjoyable grind in farming for those specific mats you need in various maps, but it's not why I personally play Guild Wars. I suspect others feel the same way and are hoping to gear up through the engaging combat, like farming fractal dungeons, or the easier strikes, or unranked PvP. They're hoping that that's where they can gear up, but no, that's not really an option. Like, I cannot fathom why there is no way to earn stat-selectable exotic gear through fractals, nor through End of Dragon's strikes. You can earn some through unranked PvP, but only armor, and you'll only get one piece per entire reward track completion. You can get the Warlord armor from ranked PvP, you can get tons of it, but you'll need to hit level 20 in PvP first before you unlock ranked. And doing all of this is really overshadowed by the ease of getting stat-selectable gear from Verdant Brink. It's just incredibly strange to me that, like, Heart of Thorns is still the easiest source of stat-selectable exotic gear, when we are now 2 expansions ahead, and End of Dragons is likely where a lot of the new players will be jumping in. End of Dragons specifically has a real problem. There is 0 source of stat-selectable exotic or ascended back piece here. There were 11 new back pieces added. 4 of them are exotics, and the stat combination on all 4 of them? Celestial. The exact stat that boosted players already have. The Antique armor seems to be the End of Dragons equivalent of the Bladed armor. It's on the first map, it costs the currency acquired from that first map. There's an added requirement. You need to hand jade statuettes to the vendor from each of the map metas before you can access her shop, which resets weekly. And the armor you can get is Berserkers. What about the one ascended back piece that you can earn through the Antique Armor Collection for buying every single one of these armor pieces? It's Berserker's stats. It's locked on Berserker's stats. I can't quite understand this. Berserker's is already, like, readily available all over the game. I really think ArenaNet should consider changing this gear to be stat selectable. Verdant Brink has had its time in the sun. People will still return to that map for the meta event like they do with the other Heart of Thorns maps. But it'd encourage all players to hang around these End of Dragons maps and allow them to gear up through these brand new events. I know I'd personally be farming the hell out of these maps if I could get a bunch of stat-selectable exotics from them. I'd love to tell people that they can just farm End of Dragons maps to gear up. Same for Path of Fire maps, actually. Like, we should probably have a source of stat-selectable gear in every expansion, just for some sort of consistency. Another thing players want right now from End of Dragons are the Dragons and Ritualist stats, but as of right now, the only way to get those stats is through crafting or buying them from the trading post. Now, I don't actually mind these stats being difficult to get. I'm actually really enjoying the chase, but there's just not enough sources for these. Like, yes, you can buy crafted armor and weapons from the trading post, but what about a back piece? As I said, there's no stat-selectable exotic or ascended back piece available in End of Dragons. So currently the only way of getting this is through having a legendary back piece. Getting trinkets is easier. I like that you can get the stat-selectable exotic trinkets from your elite spec collection. I like guiding people to that because it's a very clear direction for gearing up. And then you can go do the Harvest Temple to unlock the ascended versions of those trinkets. And that's a pretty good progression curve, but then you'll have like half ascended and half exotic gear. Ideally, new players kind of want to have like a full set of stat-selected exotic gear before they tackle the Harvest Temple, because it's quite a tricky strike. And it's really difficult to do that at the moment. I think allowing for gear progression within End of Dragons, from whatever scuffed stats they were running when they arrived, to being properly geared into full exotics for the role they want, to then getting ascended gear through strikes, that could be a really good progression path and would really help with offering a good sense of direction to new players. And it'd improve the overall health of the endgame too, because you'd have more players getting into those modes, and they'd also be performing better. Speaking of endgame, right, the rewards from endgame activities are pretty inconsistent in general. Like I said, I was working on a video going through ascended gearing, specifically without crafting, and your options are pretty limited. Raids are a pretty great source of ascended gear. The frequency of ascended gear drops in here is much higher than any other activity, and you can directly buy ascended gear with the raid currency Magnetite Shards. You can source pretty much all ascended gear from raids. There's armor, weapons, trinkets, back pieces, it's got everything. There is a 150 weekly soft cap on Magnetite Shards though, with a one-handed weapon costing like 250 shards. So yeah, raids are unarguably an excellent source of ascended gear. This is actually where I got like 80% of my ascended gear from. But it gets kind of weird when we start comparing this to other activities. So End of Dragon strikes offer ascended weapons as well, both as purchases and random drops. A one-handed weapon will cost you 250 of the green profit shards, and there's a 150 weekly shard cap. That's pretty decent, similar to raids really, but then we turn to Icebrewed Saga strikes. This is a Living World release, and here it costs 250 blue profit shards for a one-handed ascended weapon, again the same thing, but there is no weekly shard cap. Not only that, but End of Dragon strikes do not offer any source of ascended armor, whereas raids and Icebrewed Sagas do. That said, we haven't seen what the challenge modes will offer, so fingers crossed there. If you've played Icebrewed Saga Strikes, then you know they're far easier than the End of Dragons ones, and especially easier compared to raids. But I just think it's weird that the most farmable source of stat-selectable ascended gear comes from the easiest content in a Living World season, which new players probably don't have. It's just odd, you know? I think either everything should have a weekly cap or none of them should. I think more consistency between instanced PvE rewards would go a long way. On the topic of consistency, ascended gear can be bought from fractals, but it requires these Grandmaster marks on top of the fractal currency, which only come from crafting, or you can get them from the ranked PvP chest track, which offers 3 per season. PvP ascended gear also costs these Grandmaster marks on top of the PvP currency, which means there's a direct PvP path to earning ascended gear, but not a similar system for fractals. You can't get Grandmaster marks through fractals, as far as I'm aware. World vs. World also really needs help. There's ascended gear here too, but they also require Grandmaster marks on top of the World vs. World skirmish tickets. Can you get Grandmaster marks from the World vs. World chest track, which has the exact same layout as the ranked PvP one? No. You can only get Grandmaster shards, of which you only earn 3 per week, and it costs 10 to make a single Grandmaster mark. So, unless I'm mistaken, that is 4 weeks for 1 Grandmaster mark, with a one-handed ascended weapon taking almost 3 months if you were to just do World vs. World, because it costs 3 Grandmaster marks. I would advocate for straight up removing Grandmaster marks as a requirement for these items. I think the currency requirements for these activities is already a really solid, clear, obvious path to earning this ascended gear over time. They're already time-gated, and Grandmaster marks just sort of muddy these waters for new players. Because even if you finally earn all the currency that you need to get this gear, you still somehow have to get either your crafting level up or participate in ranked PvP. So I have a lot more to say on the matter, like how the game should direct new players to these stat-selectable gear sources, maybe through a post-main story quest line that takes you to the Jade Statuette vendor, and then there's stat-selectable gear there. And then you finally fully gear up, and it takes you to the Strike Portal, where there's Ascended gear. This is a whole thing. It's a whole other can of worms, so I'll probably talk about that in another video. That's a whole other thing. Like I said, I know I'm dismissing crafting here. Maybe I'm just being lazy or stubborn because I'm not big into crafting myself. But players who want to be laser focused on instance PvE, like fractals, raids, and strikes, which are arguably some of the best content in the game, by the way, they should have a clear, consistent avenue for ascended gearing as well. Looping back to my initial point, right? Exotic gearing specifically needs to be more streamlined. Vipers, Diviners, Harriers, these are all really important stat sets for some of the most commonly played and crucial roles for Guild Wars 2 content. And they shouldn't be gated by strange, disconnected methods, such as like farming one specific map from this first expansion, or buying these random bits and bobs from the trading post. Things that we only know about through word of mouth. Exotic stat-selectable gear should be more accessible, especially within the End of Dragons content, because that's where a lot of the new players are going to be jumping in. It'd keep players engaged in the new maps and events, but most importantly, it'd really help new players to work towards proper builds and jump into the endgame content sooner. I just think that this is a genuine problem, and hey, maybe I'm missing something. Let me know how you feel. As experienced players with all of the gear, we're kind of indifferent to this sort of thing. But if you're a new player, you might be struggling. So do you agree? And what other things do you think ArenaNet could do to improve the gearing experience for new players? Anyway, that's my ramble. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk. As always, I'll catch you later.